Hey, grade 9. So today we're going to continue on. We're going to learn about sexual reproduction, and we're going to compare and contrast that to the asexual reproduction you learned about last day. So to begin with, if we're talking about our learning objective, it is that you are learning the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, and that you will be identifying the different forms of sexual reproduction. We're going to talk about 3. So at the end of this, you'll know that you are succeeding if you can identify advantages or disadvantages of sexual reproduction, list the 3 types of sexual reproduction, explain the differences between conjugation and cross-fertilization, identify keywords such as fertilization, zygote, embryo, gametes, and chromosomes, and if you can compare the amounts of chromosomes in the processes of mitosis and meiosis, kind of surface level stuff on that. So let's get into it. What is sexual reproduction? Well, it's when 2 parents produce offspring. It's no longer just one. We have 2 involved, and the offspring ends up being a mixture of the genetic code of both parents' genetic code, their characteristics. So a recombination process occurs, and this results in offspring that is genetically different from both parents. So if you look at you, you're actually a combination of the genes of your dad and your mom. You both have characteristics from both of them because basically their genetic code, half of it went into you from both to make full genetic code within you. Now in sexual reproduction, there is a low number of offspring as opposed to asexual where there's tons of offspring that's produced very quickly. But we get variation, okay? So this is the trade-off. The con is that it's a low number of offspring. The pro is that the offspring that we get has variation in it. And the reason why we can achieve this variation is because it involves specialized sex cells called gametes. And we're going to talk about these specialized sex cells, but basically it's the sperm and the egg. All right, let's get into it. So advantages of sexual reproduction, I get more variation, and as a result, offspring is more able to respond and adapt to environmental changes. So because I have variation, because I have that genetic diversity, if something bad happens, right, it can survive it because there are things that can overcome that bad stress. So for example, if disease ravages a population, but there is genetic diversity because of that sexual reproduction, well then some offspring will hopefully be more resistant to the disease, and as a result they'll survive to be able to pass on those genes. Disadvantages is that a low number of offspring is produced with sexual reproduction in contrast to asexual, and it requires a large amount of energy and time. Okay, we got to make those gametes. It takes time to actually get the offspring and so on. So it just involves more resources in order to get that offspring. So we're going to talk about 3 types. The first is not, in my mind, actually sexual reproduction, but it's very closely linked. It's bacterial conjugation. Then we're going to talk about cross-fertilization in plants, and finally, sexual reproduction in mammals, which is what we normally think of when we think about sexual reproduction. So getting into it, bacterial conjugation, like I said, in my mind, this is not really sexual reproduction, but it's closely linked. And the reason why is we don't actually get new offspring from this. But what bacterial conjugation is it's the direct transfer of genetic material or DNA from one bacterial cell to another. It actually makes like this little tunnel thing labeled here as the pilus, which goes from one bacterium to another bacterium, and then actually genetic code travels from one bacteria to another. What's interesting about this is it allows for genetic diversity. So if one bacteria has, let's say, a beneficial mutation, then it can spread that beneficial mutation to other bacteria by using this. So it's a neat adaptation that bacteria have in order to swap genetic code so that advantageous genes can more readily travel between bacteria to benefit them. So it is not true reproduction. It does not result in an offspring being formed, but instead in genetic recombination between those 2 bacteriums. Now this plays a role in antibiotic resistance because when we have a bacteria that is resistant to an antibiotic, well then it can actually transfer that mutation, that genetic code that makes it resistant to the antibiotic to other bacteria. And this makes it really hard to actually control bacteria and their evolution as they evolve faster and faster and faster to be resistant to the stuff that we develop. We're actually in a bit of an arms race between us and disease. Yeah. So as bacteria and other forms of disease end up getting better and better and better at hurting us, we develop better and better drugs to combat them. But you maybe have heard about super drugs and how there are bacteria now that are just very resistant to many antibiotics. We keep on having to develop new antibiotics. And part of the reason why bacteria end up getting resistant to antibiotics is because of this bacterial conjugation that takes place, where different bacteria can swap genes that make them resistant to different things. And here you can actually see the little tubes going between bacteria, and this is meant for swapping of genetic code. So genetic code would then be swapped between these two bacteria, which would result in new genetic code that then it would pass on to its offspring as it goes through binary fission, right? Which is what bacteria does to reproduce, is asexual reproduction by binary fission. So a lot of talking. Bacterial conjugation is swapping of genetic code between bacteria. All right, cross-fertilization in plants. It requires the joining of a male gamete, so a sperm with a female gamete and egg, to produce a zygote and then an embryo. Most plants produce both male and female gametes. However, some produce only female gametes and others produce only male. Maybe you've even heard about this when it comes to like cannabis plants, that there are male plants and female plants that are actually different, and other plants do this as well. So essentially what happens is that sometimes we don't have both male and female organs on one plant, but sometimes it's actually like a plant will be male and then another plant is female. But typically on flowering plants, we have actually both male and female organs. So it produces both. Angiosperms, gymnosperms produce sexually by forming seeds. So in angiosperms, seeds are in the flower, okay? And gymnosperm seeds are instead in the cone. And we take a look at pine trees and stuff for dealing with these cones instead. We don't have to know a ton about plants, but we're going to very briefly cover stuff that you learned back in grade 7. Okay, so when we take a look, pistil is the female reproductive organ. So that's this center part right here. Okay, and then within the pistil, we have ovules that contain the eggs as well as the ovary. When we took a look at the male portion of the plant, this is the stigma right here, and then the style going down is the tube. But mainly what you need to know is pistil, okay, which is the female portion of the flower. I always think of, I don't know if you guys know that song, like Jamie has a gun or whatever, and I think about, she's got a gun, she's got a pistol, okay, and then I think about that as the female part of the plant. I know, poor memory trick, but that's all I got for this. Stamen's a lot easier. Stamen, it's stamen, it's stamen. Okay, so here I've got my anther and my filament. The anther is the larger top portion here, then the filament holds up the anther. And this is where I get pollen from that actually contains the sperm. So what happens, and we're going to look at this on the next slide, is that we have the pollen that ends up landing on the stigma, and then a pollen tube goes down the style and goes into the ovary in order to actually fertilize the eggs in fertilization. But the main thing that you need to know here, the part that I care about, is that you just know stamen is the man part, where the sperm is, and the male reproductive organ. Well, if I look at pistil, that's the female reproductive organ. All right, so in pollination, this occurs when pollen is transferred from the anther, of the stamen to the stigma of the pistil. When I talk about cross-pollination, this means specifically, pollination, this means specifically that the pollen comes from a different plant than where it lands on the stamen. So I have pollen from one plant that ends up going to the stamen of a different plant, which means that I'm getting a mixing of genetic code. So cross-pollination is where I have sexual reproduction. Well, pollination can either be sexual or asexual, depending on if the pollen landed on the same plant, which would be asexual, or a different plant than the pollen came from, which would be then sexual reproduction. This is going through the process of actually causing the fertilization. So again, the pollen lands on the the stigma, and then from there the pollen tube goes down and fertilizes, and then I end up getting, of course, a fruit from that. All right, here's the bulk. This is the main one that you need to know and focus on, which is sexual reproduction in mammals. Almost all animal species, from salmon to dragonflies to bears, reproduce sexually. Although the details may vary, the important events in animal reproduction is just the same. Requires the joining of a male gamete, sperm, with female gametes, which is egg cells. We're going to take a look at this slide, and we're going to kind of like jumble things around and move them to where they need to go to talk about what thing is which. I need to get out of presentation mode for this, which is going to make it look a little bit ugly, but bear with me here, and hopefully you can see what goes on, and then we'll go back to it in a moment. So when I talk about male gamete, that is the sperm that's shown right here, right? So I got the sperm cell. This here would actually be my female gamete, which is the egg, right? So I got the sperm and I have the egg. When this mixes together, and the sperm meets the egg, then I have fertilization taking place. So that's shown actually by this image right here, which is where the sperm makes it through the outside boundary of the egg, and then I have fertilization, which is when the genetic code ends up combining from both the sperm and the egg cell. So maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit too much here, but the sperm contains half of the genetic code, right? The egg contains the other half, and then as it combines, then I end up having fertilization. So when I talk about animals, this comes from the male, this comes from the female, and then this combines together, and I end up having then fertilization taking place. From here, I have, this I actually want to move down. I've got my zygote, and my zygote is the first cell that has full genetic code. Okay, and then I have cell division taking place over and over and over again, and then it becomes an embryo once it divides even once. I have an embryo, and then up to 11 weeks in humans, it's an embryo, at which time it turns into a fetus. Okay, so I've got male gamete, female gamete. When they meet together, that's fertilization. When I have full genetic code in one cell, that's called a zygote. Cell division happens as it splits over and over and over again by the process of mitosis, and then I end up having an embryo at the very end. So we could actually almost do like a little flow chart of this, of things moving around from one to the other to the other. All right, I'm gonna get back to presentation mode here so we can look more at this diagram. But hopefully that makes sense, the process, and kind of neat for us to go through that together. All right, so looking up the words gamete, zygote, and embryo, which pictures do you believe is which definition? So what is this? What is this? And what is this? So if I look at this without any more information, I would probably think that this is the egg, while this is the zygote, or sorry, the embryo, my bad, because it's already divided. And this would be fertilization, okay, or a zygote. So there we go. Gametes are cells specialized for reproduction. They're sex cells. Their only role, the only thing they do, is to join with another gamete during reproduction. So I have sperm cells that contain half the genetic code from the male, and then I have egg cells which contain half the genetic code from the female. When these combine, I now have full genetic code for the offspring. Fertilization is the process that occurs when the male and female gamete unite, and the genetic code ends up combining to make full genetic code for the offspring. Zygote is a cell created as a result of fertilization. It needs nutrients and moisture in order to develop. It sometimes requires warmth and protection as well. When cells are splitting into two, we call this cleavage. This happens by mitosis, but what it is it's the actual division. So as it divides, as it's separating into two cells, we call the action of this cleavage. And it keeps on dividing over and over and over again. And then we have, of course, an embryo once it has divided. All right, so a few kind of details. Fertilization, and this is actually going back again. This is almost in the wrong place with the plant cells, but we're too far into this video, so we're not going back, and a lot of this still applies. So if we're looking at animal reproduction, mammal reproduction, right, versus plant reproduction, fertilization is the same thing, but we don't have pollen. It's just directly sperm, lands on the sticky stigma, and a pollen tube grows until it reaches the ovule, one egg, and contact is made. Zygote forms and undergoes many cell divisions. And then I have an embryo. And then when I have it inside of this seed, right, I've got kind of a mini leaf, stem, and roots. And the seed protects the embryo and stores food to use for growth. Okay, compare that to sexual reproduction in mammals, where I have the egg from the female and the sperm. This meets together and then, gets fertilization. So this happens differently depending on the animal, right? Like, for example, in fish, this is actually just often happening inside of the water where the egg and the sperm meet up. And then after that, I end up getting a zygote, as it is a fertilized egg, right? And I have full genetic code. And then as it splits, I have an embryo. So a little bit different in that when I have the plant, I've got the pollen and then it lands on the stigma. Then I have a pollen tube and it meets up with the egg. Okay, and then from there I have a seed produced. Okay, and this is similar in that I still have an egg and a sperm, but the process is quite different in mammals. Now let's talk about mitosis versus meiosis. We talked about mitosis last day, which is where I have cells splitting to end up getting full genetic code. So in humans, I have 46 chromosomes, and then it ends up duplicating all the genetic code, all the organelles, and then the two daughter cells are diploid as well at 46 chromosomes. The difference in meiosis is that instead the chromosomes end up splitting in two. So I end up having 46 chromosomes. They end up actually kind of doing this thing where they end up duplicating and then doing some crossing over of genes in order to get more recombination. But at the end of the day, what I get is 4 what's called haploid cells, which means they have half the genetic code of the original. So when I end up getting my gametes, and that's what meiosis is for, is to get gametes, I end up with gametes that have half the genetic code of the original cell. Okay, so this is the process that make sperm and eggs. And again, it has half the genetic code. And the reason for that is when I take 23 chromosomes, my haploid cell from sperm, and combine it with my haploid cell for eggs, well, now the egg, what I have is full genetic code at 46 chromosomes. So half and half. Meiosis is the reason why I get genetic diversity. Okay, it's a process by which chromosomes and genes have this opportunity to actually get different genetic code in all the different sperm and egg by getting half the genetic code. And you'll learn more about the process in the video, but the most important thing is that you realize that meiosis, the process causes more variation. I get variation and I have half the genetic code. In other words, haploid cells being produced as opposed to diploid cells in mitosis. Okay, remember that when we did mitosis, we said mitosis. In other words, I get 2 cells. Well, in meiosis, I get 4 cells and they have half the genetic code. And unfortunately, there's no like 4 in this word. But yeah, anyways, meiosis has 4 cells produced with half the genetic code. All right, we're going to watch a video about meiosis, and this is again another Amoeba Sisters video. They do a fantastic job of this, and then after that we'll come back. Okay, so at the end of the day, what you learned is you learned about sexual reproduction. You learned about 3 different types that we care about, which is basically bacterial conjugation, sexual reproduction in plants by cross-pollination, and then also sexual reproduction in mammals. Important that you understand egg, sperm, fertilization, zygotes, cell division, and then embryo. Okay, and then also important that you understand the advantages of sexual reproduction, that it gets you more variation, but the big disadvantage that it takes more time and energy, so it's harder on resources. What else? Oh, mitosis versus meiosis. The fact that mitosis ends up with 2 cells with full genetic code, while meiosis ends up with 4 cells, and it happens for making gametes. That's the only place meiosis happens, is making gametes that end up having half the genetic code. So that when 2 gametes actually end up combining, well, now I've got full genetic code. I have my offspring. All right, that's it for today. Have a good one.